SIGA, the world's largest coalition in the field of sports governance and integrity, brings you the fourth webinar of the series COVID 360 Where Does Football Go Now? In partnership with Soccerex. This fourth episode will take a deep dive into the pertinent topic Football for All and gathers a stellar lineup of influential sports leaders and powerful voices on gender, diversity and inclusion. Baroness Sue Campbell, DBE, Director of Women's Football, the FA. Brian Lewis, President of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees, Trinidad and Tobago NOC, SIGA Council Member. Alex Scott, former English footballer, Arsenal WFC, pundit and presenter. ALISON GIORDANO, Vice President Consumer Marketing and Sponsorship, MasterCard. Piara Power, Executive Director, Fair Network. And Katie Simmonds, General Counsel and Senior Director, Global Partnerships, SIGA. Moderating this webinar, we have sports broadcaster Ben Jacobs.
Well, hello and welcome to the SIGA Soccerex forum entitled Football for All on Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Football. My name is Ben Jacobs. I'll be moderating today's discussion and we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please do post your questions to our 6 panelists in the YouTube chat. Stick around until the end as well. It fittingly will be lasting around about 90 minutes because we've got a musical surprise for you. Don't worry though, it's not me singing karaoke. So without further ado, let's meet our illustrious panel and get some of their opening remarks. First up, it's a very good afternoon to Baroness Sue Campbell, the Director of Women's Football at the Football Association. Sue, thank you for joining us. This panel is called Football for All. The FA's motto is the same. It's a big question, I know, to begin with, but how can you achieve football for all in practical terms?
You're right. Thank you, Ben. It's a very big challenge indeed. And I think that it comes down to 2 things really, which is opportunity and access. And I think there are many, particularly in this country, young boys that automatically found their way to football. But I think if you are a young girl in England, the challenges are much greater. And so the Football Association's role is to make sure that we increase the number of opportunities and encourage young girls to get involved in the game. And that requires really good programs, good strategic thinking, engagement with partners, particularly schools and local clubs. And so whichever area that we're trying to work on, the key is to engage with the right people, to realise that you can't do this on your own. It has to be through collaboration. And that when you provide opportunities for people to get involved in the game, that they feel included, they feel valued, and they feel like they belong. Those are really important. And I think to make football for all, it's not simple. It isn't just about opportunity, because it's also about attitude and really welcoming everyone into the game. And that's what we are trying to do. It's a big job, but it's one we're very committed to complete.
Sue, thank you. We'll pick up on some of those points in just a moment. We're delighted, though, to also be joined by the former England and Arsenal footballer Alex Scott, MBE, who is now a pundit for the likes of Sky Sports and the BBC. Alex, first up, I promise we'll be clear by tonight's Arsenal game. Now, you're on record as saying women's football has taken a back seat due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of a British government task force on the return of sport, what advice have you been giving to make sure that women's football isn't overlooked?
Yeah, afternoon everyone, to everyone tuning in. I think, I did say that. And I think actually some of the comments, once again, we was comparing it to men's football. And that's not what my intention was. I think that the first couple of weeks during lockdown, every time I turned on the TV, the conversation was about men's football. The conversation, no one was asking questions. Well, how are the women's players? What's happening with women's football? Not even just women's football football. I'm talking about women's sport in general. And that's what I was alluding to women's football took a back seat, because I know the amount of work that Sue has to do at the FA and everyone that is trying to push women's football to the forefront. I know the work and actually the knocking on the doors that they have to do every single day to keep asking for whether it's financial support, whether it's broadcast support. So for me, it wasn't that. I just wanted to kind of put the pressure out there and raise that question to everyone. Well, what's happening to women's sport in general? And now me being part of the task force, I know that I have the platform and the voice that during those meetings, I can ask those questions. And I think we saw that Oliver Dowden came out and he said, it's important. Visibility does matter. He wants his daughters, his kids growing up to see female role models, because that inspires them to want to get into sport, which is so important.
Alex, thank you for now. If you've got any questions for Alex, remember you can paste them on the YouTube chat. Remember to give your full name and title in the sports world if applicable. Alex is also a MasterCard ambassador, and Alison Giordano also joins us. She's the Vice President of Consumer Marketing and Sponsorships at MasterCard. Alison, good afternoon. We naturally, of course, associate sponsors in sport with investment, but how do you ensure your sponsorship portfolio remains inclusive?
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, SIGA, for including MasterCard in this important discussion. I'm thrilled to be here. It's a great point, and I have to say I'm super proud of working for a company that really prioritizes diversity and inclusion as a business value, and that is something that goes beyond words, and I really see it as something that's in action every single day at our business, and that permeates throughout everything that we do, including our sponsorship practice. And we work to really ensure we're building that inclusive portfolio. And it actually goes beyond the portfolio. If you think about, where we operate as a company, we're across the globe. We're in every region, and we use sponsorships in all of those regions to engage with consumers. And those are a number of different audiences that we need to engage with. So we use sport, we use properties across multiple types of passions, culinary, et cetera, music, to really engage with those audiences. And it's something that we're very keen to continue to explore. And we're committed to learning. It's having that open dialogue, working with our partners, working with our ambassadors like Alex that you mentioned and others, to see what else we can be doing. And it goes beyond portfolio to activation. How we're turning on these relationships and engaging with fans is important, and making sure that we really keep an ear to, what's current, what's relevant to, all audiences.
Thank you very much, Alison. We also have Piara Power, the Executive Director of the FAIR Network. Piara, the Black Lives Matters campaign is at the forefront of our minds right now, and we'll delve into this with all of the panel over the course of the next 90 minutes. The Premier League will re-kick off today with shirts supporting it, yet the Czech League recently resumed with fans inside the stadium, and there was still racist chants. How have FAIR been supporting the Black Lives Matters campaign?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the question. Hello, everybody. Listen, our role really is to try to use this moment. This is a big moment, I think, for a lot of people who are interested in racial equality and indeed embedding inequalities of all kinds. Some of the things that we've seen happening in the States, the impact of that we've seen globally, means that this really is a change moment. And for us and many others, it's about trying to go beyond the symbolic, trying to see if we can build things that are going to create the sort of equality that we want to see. So that means, how do we change, for example, the diversity in leadership in football governing bodies? How do we get more coaches from former Black players taking those jobs and those roles? They're well qualified. How do we do that? Of course, on a broader level, we're working with a lot of governing bodies, advising them on some of the positions that they should be taking, talking to grassroots organizations that are our members and we're working with across the world, trying to support what they want to do in their communities with the objective of making sure that this isn't a moment that passes, but one that we can look back in a few years' time and say that it was a genuine change moment.
Absolutely. So let's add now a perspective from outside the world of football only. We have Brian Lewis with us, the president of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees. Brian, good afternoon. When you were elected in 2018 to CANOC, that's the acronym for Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committees, you called specifically for gender equality. What steps have been taken to achieve that since?
Well, let me answer the question this way. Martin Luther King once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Fannie Lou Hamer once said, no one is free until everyone is free. And I say that to say this. The issue within sport reflects the issues within society as it relates to gender inequality and racial inequality. I'm on public record, as you said, of saying when I became president of the Caribbean Association of National Olympic Committee, that in terms of Caribbean sport and the Olympic movement, that there should be gender equality. When I became president of the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee, I made it very clear that we will strive to gender equality. That has been done. And I've said that the next president of the Trinidad and Tobago Olympic Committee should be a female. I'm also on record as saying that the next president of the International Olympic Committee should be a female. So there are issues in societies and the world of sport is no exception as it relates to gender inequality. But as we have seen within recent times, this is a moment in time when we are also dealing with racial inequality, and we can't get around it. There are some historical realities that make all types of inequalities systemic, structural, and historical. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today to honestly have a dialogue about why we have some of those issues.
Brian, thank you for those opening remarks. You also win the award for the best backdrop on this particular, and also congratulations for that as well. Good to see the shirts and the scarves.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. The best backdrop.
Trophy. So last but certainly not least, let's turn to Katie Simmons, who is with us representing SIGA. Katie, good afternoon to you as well. What are SIGA doing to promote inclusion in sports governance?
Good afternoon, Ben, and thank you to all our speakers for accepting our invitation today. I think we can be truly proud that today we have true diversity on our panel in every form. SIGA is doing a lot in the space of sport integrity to further this issue. One of the key things, and I would like to say that we've identified this as an issue back in 2015 when we first developed the concept of SIGA. We put good governance on the board as one of our key reform agendas, and it is ingrained in our universal standards on good governance in sport. We call for equality for both gender, inclusivity, and diversity. And I think it's just sad and devastating that we're in 2020, the start of a new decade, which promised to be so promising and full of hope. And in fact, it's taken the murder of George Floyd for us to raise this issue in our public consciousness, because it's an issue that's been there and it's been prevalent. And this has just surfaced it and come to the forefront. I'm looking forward to explaining more about SIGA's reform agenda, but I think without further ado, let's get straight down to the bulk of the chat.
Katie, thank you. So we've heard from each of our 6 panelists. Once again, if you're watching on YouTube, please put your questions in the chat element of it, and then we'll be able to involve many of you in each of these topics. We won't wait until the end to bring you in. If you have a question on any particular topic, then make sure you get them in early, and I'll try and weave them in throughout the chat. We're going to break this down into 3 different sections: gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we'll start for the next 15 or 20 minutes with gender. And Sue, I'd like to turn to you first, but other panelists, feel free at any point to get involved in the debate. The Premier League, of course, restarts today, 6 o'clock, Aston Villa, Sheffield United, Manchester City and Arsenal also in action. But in England, the WSL and the Women's Championship were concluded early based on points per game. How badly, Sue, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will set back the women's game in England?
Well, I'm the ever optimistic person. So it isn't, you know, it was very disruptive for us. We have seen a massive growth in the women's game in the last 3 years. We've managed to double the number of girls taking part in the game. We've more than doubled the fan base. We had 11.5 million people watch the semi-final at the World Cup with England playing the United States. That then ran on into many of those people coming to WSL games and Women's Championship games. So it was a really tough moment for us to stop. We felt like we had massive momentum. So I don't underestimate it. Will be difficult to regain that momentum, but we're very clear when we're coming back. We are already talking about return to play. We're working with the Super League and the Championship clubs. The players are very keen to get back and get playing. We've already talked to broadcasters about getting better broadcast coverage in those few weeks when we come back, because we're going to hopefully come back before the men's game starts again, which gives us a nice blank canvas and a window to really raise the profile of the women's game. So of course it will take time. Of course it will be challenging. But I think there is a momentum for women's football now in England, which has grown over the last few years, and I'm optimistic we will regain that ground.
Alex, what terms would you like to see women's football return on in, as we understand it, September? It's one thing just returning, it's another thing picking up what Sue called momentum.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I even go back to, I was impressed even with Jurgen Klopp last season, or at the start of this season actually, when he got asked the question, he was like, so are you going to just pick up where you left off? And he was like, well, no, because last season we didn't win. It's not good enough. So we need to be better. We need to put things in place. So this season we are ready to pick up that trophy. And that's exactly what he's done. And it's the same with women's football. Yes, we've got this momentum off the World Cup, but it's always, okay, we know now every time it's proven from history. Every time there's a World Cup or a Euros, we have momentum, but it's always about making sure that things are in place, that in women's football, we are ready. And that's what Sue does. She's got a great team around her. And for me, I am positive. Okay, the WSL, it stopped, but now we need to be positive. So in terms of, I know my platform when I'm sitting on TV, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about men's football, but I'm also representing women's football. I know that there's young boys watching me at home as well as young girls, and that then becomes normal. It becomes part of the conversation. So while women's football, yes, we're not getting to watch it on TV or go down to our local games, we've still got a massive part to play. And that's where we need to remain positive and we can still push women's football forward.
And Alex, I know that you mentioned Jurgen Klopp there, and also that you don't like anyone overly comparing the men and women's games directly, because they are ultimately very different prospects in terms of the actual football we see, but also every other aspect of the game, including their marketability. So it is a slightly glib comparison, but we are seeing Liverpool's men's side run away with the title, and their women's team were relegated from the WSL. Does that in any way illustrate the gulf of support between the sexes in your view?
Well, I think it's in terms of when I look at my own club, Arsenal, there was a time where we were champions, we were great, we were that big powerhouse in women's football, and then we stood still. And I think it's the same with Liverpool. You know, they invested into the women's team, they won the WSL the first couple of years, but then their investment stood still. And so at the moment, yes, maybe they need to look at the infrastructure, how to get in the development through, so they don't have to keep recruiting from abroad. It needs to be looked at if they are going to really push on to obviously get that club back to where it needs to be.
Sue, I know you wanted to pick up on something that Alex said.
Yeah, well, Alex is a great answer. I think I would not want to underestimate the massive commitment we have, though, from the Premier League clubs into the Women's Super League. I mean, you know, we are very blessed in that sense, that we have partners in the development of the women's game who are very committed to it. And the new board that we've established, which is the Super League and Championship board, has really moved the game forward massively. And we see ourselves very much at the FA in partnership with the clubs, and that the clubs are investing in the game massively. And, you know, the bottom line is sometimes you struggle to get, as Alex said, a winning team. I do not doubt for a moment that Liverpool will bounce back and do extremely well next year. But we're also seeing in the Championship more and more full-time teams. So Leicester have gone full-time. We'll have Liverpool as full-time, Durham, Sheffield. So what's starting to happen is the professional game is now going from one league to half a league with the others part-time. So we're seeing a strengthening, and all of that is down to investment by men's clubs in the women's game. While, you know, what's happened on the field of play isn't great for Liverpool, I have no doubt about Liverpool's commitment to the women's game.
Chiara, let's get your take on this. Fair have been a part of the so-called all-in and step-up equality campaigns in recent years. Are we starting to see results from these type of campaigns that a lot of sports federations, players, clubs tend to support? Or are we still in that sphere of just words and promises rather than proven results?
Well, I think there are two elements that we would look at. One is, if you take COVID right now, the reaction that leaders in football have had to women's football has been mixed. I think on the one hand, you have international governing bodies who are saying the right things, investing where they have to, who understand the difficulties. But then at a national level, it's really difficult to find countries where the treatment of men's football and women's football has been equitable. And I would look at an area like Latin America where there are particular problems. There are a lot of very talented women in Latin America. But if you look at some of the countries there, you know, you can go from, I've got a list because we've done some work on it, Colombia, Paraguay, Peru, Brazil, Mexico. All of these countries have treated the women's game very different to men's football. And in some of the treatment has been pretty bad. You know, you have clubs in Brazil who are receiving money from the FA to invest into women's football, but the clubs are not bringing it down into the women's team. So there's a lot of sort of disparities like that globally that you can look at. And I think it's the same picture with some of the projects that you talked about and the campaigns that you talked about. The campaign to get more women involved as leaders. In some countries, it's going very well. In other countries, it's very, very, very difficult because of patriarchal attitudes.
Alison, let's bring you in from a sponsorship perspective. What would attract a sponsor like MasterCard to women's sport, and particularly developing women's sports that is in desperate need of the kind of investment that MasterCard could provide?
Yeah, I mean, sure. As I mentioned earlier, we cover a number of different passions. Sport is a passion for many. And, you know, we look at women's sport as you know, absolutely growing and an area that we want to support and have been supporting over the years, and something that's growing within our portfolio. Football specifically, you know, we've been building relationships across the board with a number of athletes, and also with clubs, whether it's Arsenal or OL. We also you know, support national and or, you know, regional competitions. And for us, there's a little bit of a, you know, I guess, equalness, or you can make a comparison even to our industry, right? So in tech, you know, I think earlier it was said, you know, there needs to be a little bit more focus on development for girls. You know, we have the same challenges.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Sorry?
I think you were just cut off by a bit of background noise, Alison, but please continue.
So I was just going to say, you know, in the tech world, you know, one of our focus is about getting more girls into STEM, getting more girls into the tech business. You know, I think it's something that we then transfer and look at when we're working with partners in football, when we're working with partners in golf, rugby. It's about getting more girls, more women into the game, whether it be on the playing side or the business side. So again, it goes to the audiences we're trying to reach. And I think there's a unique opportunity, you know, in women's sports specifically to reach audiences. So that's what we look at.
So to Katie and Sue and Brian, please come in off the back if you have anything to add on this. Do we achieve gender equality first and foremost by making our board more representative, or do we have to start a little bit lower down and build upwards?
Well, if I may, coming at this point, I think that what we have to stop doing is focusing on the symptoms of the issue, and you kind of touched on it. In terms of both gender inequality and racial inequality in sport, it reflects, as I was saying earlier, on society. The bottom line is that if you look at the structural setup of sport, it's European, and in the main, it's an old boys club, driven a lot by white privilege, and therefore the concepts and notions that have gone back into the 17th century, as it relates to, and as a result of over 400 years of the domination of European civilization on the world. The two things that really impact sport and the society, gender inequality and racial inequality, go back to the notion that in the case of Black-colored, indigenous, and First people, that somehow they're not fully human and not deserving of the rights of what some people consider the master race. And like female and women, they were seen at a particular point in time as property. So you look at part of the issues, and you look at, as you said, the decision making and table at the international level, where a lot of the decisions are made and sent down. Sport is no exception to business, etc. There is a dearth or a lack of female at the head table making decisions, and similar in terms of diversity and inclusion. And we have to stop dancing around the core issue, the root cause of the problem. And I'm suggesting that that inequality, both gender and racial, and systemic, and it needs to be addressed until we build the situation and deal with it, and people give an honest assessment at the level of this sport hierarchy. We're just going to be PR and spin and tokenism, and there's not going to be any real sustainable change.
May I go ahead? Thanks. Thank you, Ben. Yes, so certainly I would say it's twofold actually. It's both on the structural governance side. There's things which SIGA in our good governance standards have in place. Term limits, that stops perpetuating power. If you have term limits where the people at the top are in it for 2 terms, maximum 3 terms, that is one of the systemic changes which will then filter down. Another change is obviously on the governance of the board. And at SIGA last year, we did an independent survey just in relation to the 32 international federations that are internationally recognized, the sports federations out there, and 18.3% of those international federations had any representation on the board. It's less than 20%. So in order to do that, you know, we can think about quotas, but they aren't always helpful. There needs to be a strong mechanism in order to encourage that. And to pick up on what Sue said at the beginning, I wrote down 2 words, and that's opportunity and access. Those are absolutely critical. And that's why we've developed a 12-month robust program at SIGA, putting this agenda on the table 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We do not want to just confine this issue for 1 day a year on International Women's Day. That is not a success. We want to continue the ambition and continue the change. We have our mentorship program, and I'd encourage any of the young women watching from any background, if you can see it, you can be it. You can be a leader. Proclaim it. Leadership is exerted. And we want to create those pathways. And I'd love to invite Sue, Alison, and Alex to be one of our mentors. I think you could add a great deal. And certainly you're inspirational for a lot of the women wanting to be in the sports sector today.
Ben, I haven't got a lot to add to that. I absolutely agree that it's too easy to pay lip service to equality through programs or initiatives, but I think it is structural. I think it's mighty important that we get governance right. But equally, having spent my lifetime working in sport and supported lots of women travel their journey through to leadership positions, I realise that many women have the capability and the competence, but not always the confidence to step forward and take on those positions. And, you know, I could quote the people I found, if you like, in the Football Association when I started there, who are all still there, who've all progressed massively, and all who've been given opportunities to grow and become leaders. And I think it's one of those opportunities where we sometimes have to behave in a somewhat unequal way to give people equal opportunity. And we certainly have to examine what we mean by leadership and how we define both good management and good leadership. Because so often the norms are male, and we'll look at women and find them not matching up to those norms. We don't want them to. They provide something very different, unique, special. And that's why when you get a balanced board of men and women, you usually get good decision making, because actually they're not the same, they're different, and they view the world through a different end of the microscope often. So I'm massively supportive of structural change, and I'm massively supportive of growing young women with great capability to have the confidence to step forward, to lead in their own authentic style, and to add massive value because they are what they are, which is great women, not pretending to be copying other behaviours that they've seen which they think are successful.
Yeah, well said too. Katie mentioned two words, Alex, opportunity and access, and Sue spoke about confidence. And another word you could throw into the mix is respect, because if women are not given respect in any role as footballers, as people on boards, then it's going to knock their confidence. And you've spoken very candidly in the past, perhaps even more so post-retiring than when you were a player, about the level of sexist abuse and trolling that has been and continues, unfortunately, at times to be directed towards you. How can we stop this level of sexism and so often casual, faceless and anonymous sexism through things like social media, knocking the confidence of anyone really, but in this particular context, you? How do you deal with that, and how do we put a stop to it?
Well, I think it goes back to actually what Brian touched on earlier. We know that there are people sitting at the top that have been there for years and years and years, and they can't accept the change and they don't want the change, but change is happening. Yes, be it slowly, but some people fear change. And I know I've had to take the bulk of it being kind of that first female pundit, but I know that at times it was very hard. But I was trying to look at the bigger picture, and actually me continuing to do that job is opening up doors. And I know people see me on TV. It's inspiring them to know that there is a pathway for them coming through. So yeah, it was very challenging at times. And I look back and I think, well, why? Why did I have to take that? When I look back through all my career, I think I've gone through it all in terms of when I'm talking about racism, sexism. It's made me a tough cookie. I know that. It's put me in place for what I do now to deal with a lot of things, but I shouldn't have had to go through that, because when we look at it, all I wanted was that equal opportunity. I wanted to be respected and not have to work 10 times harder than the person that I'm sitting next to. But I knew that I had to do that. In terms of when I knew I was still playing football, I never wanted anyone to think that, oh, I was just given a job, or I am that token person. So I made sure that I went out and I got my media degree. I know that when I sit on TV, actually looking around, that, well, actually that makes me more qualified than some of the other people, because they haven't got a media degree, but no one mentions that. But it's always that, what do I know? I've come from women's football, but that's where football is football. I will sit and watch Arsenal play this evening and have the same opinions if I go to the Arsenal women's game and watch their game, because football is just football, and that's how we need to see it and enjoy it.
Definitely, and well said. So let's bring in a question from some of our viewers now, starting with Josh Owens. We've got quite a few to get through. And just a reminder, if you are following this panel, please do leave your name so we can give you a shout out. I will, of course, read out some of the anonymous ones, though, as well. Josh Owens, though, writes to the whole panel, in achieving equality in women's football, do you feel it's more important for commercial entities like sponsors and rights holders or public institutions to shift focus and support towards women's football?
Well,
if I may, sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go. I've said plenty.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to keep sounding repetitive, but Peter Drucker once said you could have the best strategy in the world. Culture will eat strategy for lunch. In a lot of countries, it's cultural how they look at women and girls and their involvement and where their place is in society. In the context of gender equality, I've been very open in saying it. Just like the Old Boys Club mentors, identifies and nurtures succession and future leaders, what you need for decision making as it relates to gender equality is you also need, in addition to the tremendous work being done by a lot of visionary and forward thinking and committed and dedicated women, you need men to also be part of this fight, because men need to also mentor women. Men need to also give up in many ways their positions and sense of entitlement and the decision making and head table. So whether it is in the corporate boardroom, which also has its own problem, I don't know that many commercial and corporate sectors have the moral right to talk to sport about gender equality, because many of them, and that's documented, studies have shown that there is an issue in terms of women at the decision-making process. So I'm saying again that to get any type of movement forward that is deep-seated and structural, you need to have a fundamental change. We need more women at the decision-making table so that decisions will reflect the concerns and issues of the diversity of what the modern world looks like.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian's, I agree with everything Brian's saying. I think that the position I've taken around commercial partnership for the women's game is that, for me, women's football is more than football. For me, it's about the opportunity to use this very powerful brand that we have in society to affect change for girls and women. And football is so powerful because it does communicate, as Brian said, both to men and women. It reaches homes and is talked about in so many homes, that if you can use the sport to really build an understanding that women can be great athletes, that they can be great coaches, that they can be great referees, that they can lead sport, it affects a mindset. And whilst I totally agree with Brian about structural change, we've also got to win hearts and minds. And part of what we're trying to do the whole time in football is say to our corporate and commercial partners, this is way more important than just football. This is about looking after girls and women in society. And if I take our major sponsor of Barclays, who came in, the biggest sponsorship in women's sport in England, they didn't come just because it was football. They came because they wanted to make a real commitment to girls and women and to invest in the leadership and development of women through football. And I think that's where we can get more commercial support, because I think people understand that an investment in the women's game is an investment in women in society, not just in the game of football.
Just before we broaden this out beyond just gender equality and start talking about diversity at large and inclusion, one final question, and I think it's an interesting one to Sue and or Alex, from Phil Carling, the head of football at Octagon. He asks, given the challenges that may face the WSL following the COVID-19 pandemic, would the WSL be better off under Premier League control rather than the FA?
Well, I'll answer it from a political stance. The Premier League did look at whether it was ready to take on the Women's Super League. But equally, the Women's Super League and Championship Board, which is made up of 6 of our clubs, 3 people from the FA and 3 independent members, discussed that at length and felt that actually the women's game is still evolving. We don't know its true value yet. We've only been professional for less than 2 seasons. We believe that the game will grow and be very, very special in its own right. And in discussions with the Premier League, we both agreed, both them and us, that this was not the right moment. That moment may come in the future, but what we want to do, work with the clubs to build the value of the game, to get better broadcast, ensure that the product is great, continue with the great commercial partner we've got, grow the game so that when it is decided where it's managed in the future, it's managed in the right way and in the best interests of women and women's football.
And Alex, whatever body controls women's football, both the WSL and below it, I guess the other key point is the audience it gets and where the football is aired. So on the one hand, it's very positive that FA Player launched this season because all of the WSL games were available and certain championship ones. But on the other hand, aside from BT Sport, there weren't rights holders coming in and paying for those games. So is the next step to not only make the games readily available on a platform, but ensure that there's a value placed on that and then the money filters back to the teams?
Yeah, I think when we look at the first launch of the WSL, it was about visibility. So in terms of trying to get a broadcast that would pay for it, I think it was very different when we launched. I think Sue can go and talk about a bit more about the financial side, where now the TV rights, they are up. Correct, Sue?
Correct, yeah.
So that discussion now changes because everyone can see in terms of sponsorship with partners coming in that there is a value and there is a market. And we know that by the way that actually, I think we have to applaud BBC and how they showcased the Women's World Cup last year. The reason that they got that figures because they treated it like any World Cup. Not, oh, this is a Women's World Cup. No, we are broadcasting a World Cup and we're going to do it like we would if it was any other World Cup. And so people saw the quality, the in-depth conversation, the discussion, the storytelling of the athletes. And that's why people wanted, they didn't even just follow the England women's team, they followed everyone's story through this from the start of the tournament all the way to the end. Because when you look at what the quarterfinal v France and USA, the viewing figures were, even BBC couldn't believe it. But that's because you gave them the whole story and the journeys of the athletes. And that's when Sue's talking about, it's more than just football. It's actually having these female footballers say what they've gone through, the struggles, and they're open, they're willing to. And now it's actually funny when I think about men's football, we're only starting to see that in the men's game, where women have actually been at the forefront of that and been open and honest for a lot longer in telling their stories. And I think when we even Alison, I like the word that she said, it's relationship. We don't want to just be partnered or sponsored with someone and they don't care and they don't value. I remember at the start of lockdown, MasterCard actually getting on the phone and me being on a Zoom call with them. And they're saying, Alex, what can we do? This is the time where we've said that we want to grow the women's game. We want to show our support. Well, this is the time women's football does need you. And this is the time for the sponsorship and the commercial side to step up. And that's why I like MasterCard. They was like, well, do we need to go into grassroots? Do we need to have these conversations with clubs? Because we're here for the long run. So we don't want these short-term partnerships. It's about those relationships.
So we're roughly at half time now, so that should technically mean that someone brings us all a cup of tea and an orange, but we'll go straight through into the second half and we'll broaden things out to diversity and inclusion. And I guess my first question to all of the panel, and each of you please feel free to give an opinion here off the back of each other, is when we talk about diversity and inclusion, are terms like women's football, which is very broad, and more specifically in the context of this next portion of debate, BAME, are they helpful or are they simply to catch all?
Well, they reflect the reality of society, as I was sharing earlier on. Sport doesn't exist in a vacuum. It reflects society. And there are some, as we were saying, structural realities in the societies across the world that are cultural, whether it be the issue of women, girls, and black, colored, ethnic, whatever. These are realities. And again, you know, part of the reason we seem to not be grasping what needs to be done is because it is a very complex and emotional. They are very complex and emotive issues and topics, and they make for uncomfortable conversation. The realities are there in the way the media deals with women, in the sexualization of women in sport. These are real things. The way the racism that occurs in the English, whether it be the English Premier League and whatever, these are not things that can be and can continue to be swept under the carpet. And that's one of the things that the world is addressing now, whether it be the COVID-19 following on the back of Black Lives Matter. These are not topics and issues we can sweep under the carpet anymore. There are significant issues. And what COVID-19 has shown and done is that across societies, women and Black and colored people are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I'm saying again that that's the reality of society, and sport will be impacted by that.
Anyone else on the panel got a view specifically on the word BAME, and whether it is useful or whether it's to catch all? Katie, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, from a SIGA perspective, what we're drafting is universal standards. They're out there. And we actually, you know, one of the considerations was, do we use categories such as BAME? We decided not to, because they are truly universal and global. And the danger of using categories like that is you were then, by trying to be inclusive, no doubt you exclude somebody from somewhere else. And so we've avoided that in our drafting of those standards.
I think actually from my point of view, someone who would fall into the category of that description, you know, it's useful when you're having policy discussions so that people know the effect. In effect, you're talking about ethnic minorities, but you're being a bit more specific who the ethnic minorities in the UK are. As an international term, it doesn't wash. You know, as a term that recognizes people's experience, it doesn't wash, because everybody feels they're lumped under one umbrella. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement right now is about racial equality generally, but especially for people of African heritage. You know, that's where we see the disparities in the US in the policing of African American communities. That's where many people in this country, in the UK, want to take this debate and are right to take this debate. That's why we've had a discussion publicly, when you go back to the issue of representation and power on boards, about the number of Black people on sporting boards. I think there's 2 across all of the national governing bodies in the UK. And that's why we say that that's a priority as well. And then I think if you link, you know, COVID has brought up a lot of inequalities. It's brought up a lot of things to the surface that are already there, including, as Brian has mentioned, the impact of COVID unfairly, disproportionately on ethnic minority communities. But you also have the Premier League starting tonight, and there will be Black players out there. In the Premier League, about 1/3 of the players are Black, who, if they're infected, that could have you know, a harsher impact on them than their white colleagues. If they then go back and spread that into their families, if they are infected, that could have a harsher impact. So all of this requires more planning. It requires specific focus. And this, in essence, is what we're talking about when we when we look at equality and diversity, understanding people's needs, how we meet those needs, and making sure that we are giving people respect, equal platforms, equal representation.
Alison, just to bring you in here, how much of a factor when MasterCard choose a sporting event is, for example, the BAME community, if we are to use that word? Because ultimately there's lots of different criterion, isn't there, when a sponsor comes into a sports event, and ultimately it has to have an audience, it has to be marketable, and it has to be right for your brand. But sometimes you go away from that criterion and specifically say, we want to support an event that will benefit Black athletes because it has a high proportion of them, for example, or we want to invest in something that will grow the game for the Asian community. Do you ever pick a specific demographic because you feel that you have almost a moral responsibility to do so as a sponsor, and because you find your actual clientele using the MasterCard product are also from that demographic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, you know, our business values. Diversity and inclusion, you know, is at the center of who we are as a company. And we have a number of audiences that we serve as a business across the globe in almost every country around the world. And so, you know, when we look at our sort of investment strategy or activation strategy, you know, we're taking into account the business need at the local market level. So, you know, if we're looking at, you know, sponsoring an event in Singapore, like the, you know, SIA Games, in Philippines, excuse me, you know, we're looking at all opportunities, and we're identifying based on the audience, whether it's through a customer or directly that we're trying to reach. That's sort of what drives us to, you know, the property we're evaluating. But we also look at the values of the organization, right? Or even in the case of when we partner with athletes or you know, celebrities or whatever it may be, we look at, you know, the values, and are we aligned on, you know, mission? Do we feel we can collectively together improve in a certain area? You know, we've done a number of different activations to, whether it's, you know, standing up for or against women's harassment in football in Brazil, you know, actively partnering with an organizing body, but also with local grassroots organizations. But again, going back to the question, I think it really just, it depends on, you know, what our local market need is, you know, that's going to largely be what's driving our investment, as well as the alignment with values and ensuring it's going to support whatever the communication and message we're trying to achieve.
Don't forget to keep your questions coming as well on gender equality, inclusion and diversity in football. You can put them in the YouTube chat. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Katie touched at the beginning of this panel on the tragic death of George Floyd, and recent answers are moving us into this sphere of how can sport have a voice, and ultimately, if it so chooses, as a individual league or player, to protest against something not directly related to sport. And we'll see this, obviously, Sue and Alex, when the Premier League starts this evening with the Black Lives Matter campaign. But we've also seen it through, for example, Marcus Rashford, who's chosen during the COVID-19 pandemic to use his voice and platform to get the government to U-turn and thus extend school meal vouchers. How important is it that sports stars, clubs and federations, and I think, Sue, let's start with you, are aware of the power of their voice to protest?
I mean, we at the FA have had a very serious discussion about Black Lives Matter, and I think what we're very keen to do is something meaningful, not simply something that looks like, you know, a gesture of goodwill. I think tackling things like the structural ones that the Brian's talked about, you know, we're looking at this in a very serious way, and starting with governance, obviously, as being a really key one. But I think it's really, really important that we understand that sport can change lives, and that the role models that we create are more than just people who play a sport. And I think quite often, because sports people are very focused, that's why they're good, they work hard, they train hard, they become successful because they're very focused and commit an enormous amount to their sport. They don't realise the power they have to use that position to really change much more significant and wide-meaning things in society. And I think what Marcus has done should be absolutely applauded, in that, you know, he has not forgotten where he came from. He's used his platform to remind all of us that this is a really, really tough time for many families and many children. And I think sports people have that power to just model, but also to speak out for things that really matter. And my first teaching job was in Moss Side, Manchester, when I first left college. And I learnt more from those young people and their challenges and understanding how to stand up for yourself through them and with them than I probably at the time realised. And it's helped me understand that if you use sport effectively, it can not just change lives, it can empower people. And through that, you can begin to change society and societal norms.
Can I say something quickly, please, in terms of George Floyd? You know, condolences go out and respect what has happened, the police murder of George Floyd on the 25th of May. But Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in Robben Island.
Yeah.
Malcolm X was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Since the 17th century, slavery, colonialism, the 1969, there was an international convention for the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. They are entering the last 4 years of the United Nations declared International Decade for People of African Descent. Let's not lose sight of the fact that it's not just the George Floyd. In the context of racial, the battle for racial equality and for the move where people will accept that people of African descent, colored, First People, and indigenous people are full human beings, and we aren't property. That needs to be addressed. This is not a battle that began, and a war, and a fight that began on the 25th of May with the brutal police murder of George Floyd. This is a battle that has been going on for over 500 years. I just wanted to make that point with all due respect.
Brian, you're absolutely right to make that point, and it's very eloquently put. Alex, coming back to football, and in the context of that point, one thing that George Floyd's murder has achieved is a U-turn by both MLS in football in America and the NFL on their protest stance, particularly in kneeling. And Colin Kaepernick obviously started and continues that campaign, but a lot of people may not remember or realize outside of football spheres that Megan Rapinoe also kneeled in solidarity as well. Give us the player's perspective. How difficult is it in teams that operate as we rather than I to go into a dressing room as a minority and say, I want to go against the grain, I want to protest, and I want others to follow? It takes a lot of courage, doesn't it?
It's a lot of courage and bravery to be that person to lead the way. And just going on from Brian's point as well, it was Nelson Mandela and one of his famous quotes when he said that sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to unite and inspire in a way that little else does. It brings hope when there was once darkness. And I think that we see that through sport, through players like Marcus Rashford, through Raheem Sterling. Basically, we're at a point now with everything that is going on where Raheem said last week, players are tired. How many times have we had this conversation where nothing has been done? And I've been on a Zoom call earlier with the same conversation that I've been on a couple of years ago. But the main thing that's coming up now is we have to make people accountable. and through across all platforms. And I think it's for businesses or for everyone to actually look at themselves first and say, well, before I ask anyone else to make change, is my own house in order? Is my company doing things? Are we following the values? Are we representing before pointing any fingers at anyone else? And I think that the same goes into a football environment, into a changing room. If I know someone is standing up for something so strong that they believe in, I'm going to follow. And yes, we've seen, obviously, with Colin Kaepernick and all the thing that he followed that suit and no one followed him, and it's taken us to get till now. It's because people are tired. We've got to a point that, yes, we've been fighting and having the same conversation. And I don't want to be a part of something that hasn't got bones. I don't want to be a part of something that I don't believe that we're going to affect change. But I now remain positive with everything that I've seen. And one of the great quotes that have come out that I get behind at the moment is, I suppose, the secret of change is to focus on all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but now on building the new. How can we all now move forward in a positive way to affect change?
Building the new and getting your house in order, those are phrases, Alex, which actually goes to the DNA of SIGA. And I would say that we're currently in the 5th industrial revolution, where values and causes, they actually matter. People are standing up, they're taking to the street, they're taking the decisions out of the government's hands, as Marcus Rashford's done, and he's creating his own public policies. And how are they doing that? They're doing that through the power of public opinion. And that's exactly how we're going to create this cultural change. And that's what we're doing at SIGA. We've created an independent rating and verification system where all sports organisations will be assessed on an independent basis in accordance with our universal standards, and we will publish the results. It's not operated by us, it's operated by an independent third party, the British Standards Institutions. And that's exactly so that the sponsors, the fans, the broadcasters can see for the first time where each sport is governed, where it comes up to in terms of the rating system. And obviously, as diversity is one of those key areas, they will be able to see the progress on a yearly basis in terms of board diversity. Because with it, I think we'll only create cultural change if we create a will. And I think to date, there's been a lack of will to change. And where there's a will, there is a way to change. So I'm hopeful that we can make those deep-seated cultural changes through the tide of public opinion. Because I think that now all of us, we all have voices, they're all heard, and they all matter.
Alison, protests and sponsors don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes sponsors like to play a straighter back, but when you have a captive audience and often a wider demographic, because a bigger statement than just sport is being made, sponsors can play into that and take a moral stance and side with campaigns, particularly when they pertain to things such as inclusion and equality. Can you give me an example of when MasterCard have chosen to take an active stance, and how did that play out for you? I believe you actually alluded to one example, for instance, in one of your last answers that took place at the Copa Libertadores, which was last year. So maybe you could give us some more detail on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for the question, Ben. Yeah, as mentioned, so in Brazil, we're a sponsor of Copa Libertadores, and we, our organization, identified that, a majority of women do not attend football matches live in Brazil. We're a sponsor of Copa Libertadores. We want to make sure that the full fan base is able to engage with the activities and the excitement of the game. So we decided, let's do something about it. We also learned through our research that, sexual harassment is rampant in stadiums. And so we wanted to address that head on. We actually reached out to a number of women fan groups of some of the major Brazil football clubs and worked with them on a campaign, and then partnered with CAMPBELL to turn it on during the tournament. And actually, it was in English. The program was called Let Her Cheer. And the idea was we created red cards, and we distributed them to fans as they were attending the match. And on those red cards on the back were phone numbers for local police, as well as for hotlines for women. And what we did was encourage both men and women, when they saw something, to say something, and actually call people out right there by raising that red card in the air when they saw harassment happening in the stadium. And, you know, it was something that we were very proud of, and that actually really started a larger conversation in the market, you know, across the media. So that's a little bit more about, you know, what we did there. And, you know, again, we felt very strongly about it and wanted to support it and ensure that, you know, everyone inclusively could enjoy the sport.
Alex, the ultimate player protest is still walking off regardless of consequences. What's your take on how a player should respond if there is a form of racism or wider inequality taking place actually during a game? I know from Sue's perspective, there's clear reporting guidelines for after, but in that heat of the moment, what's your personal opinion on whether players should or shouldn't walk off?
Yeah, this is a tough one, because I've always been at that ilk of you kill him with kindness. You know, you keep going. What do? They don't want you to win the game. They want it to come to a halt. And I think Raheem was asked the same question the other day, and he said the same thing. I want to carry on. I want to play. I want to make sure that I win that game, because that's going to leave them hurting in the first place. And actually, if it's gotten to that point, I know there's that 3-point process. It shouldn't take for it to get to the third point for them to decide to walk off a pitch anyway. It's already happened. It's already happening. It needs to be stopped before you actually even get to the point where you are actually considering walking off the field of play. But yeah, I think I stand with Raheem in that sense. You know what? I want to go on and win the game. I want to carry on being successful, because I know that hurts you more.
And Sue, just to follow on from that, as I alluded to a moment ago, in the aftermath of any kind of injustice or abuse, and this is applicable not just to players, but the wider football community and fans in stadiums as well, the FA this year released new guidelines as to how you should report any form of discrimination at all levels of the game. Just give us an overview of the FA's commitment towards finding culprits, whether that is through digital, whether that's in a football stadium, whether that's in a grassroots game, who you work with, and how ultimately you are trying to punish the right people and stamp any kind of discrimination out of the game.
Well, it's one of our main game changers for us as a strategic game changer. It's easy to use that word. I think Brian referred to that. It's easy to use the word strategy. But I think we want to play our part in stamping out discrimination. There are lots of partners that we need to work with to do that. You know, there are all our football stakeholders, people like Kick It Out, Premier League, the EFL, the National Leagues, the Women's Super League and Championship. So it's about us working collaboratively to try to literally say that discrimination is totally unacceptable in any part of the game. Polly, who's our legal director, seems to spend her life on cases looking at people who've behaved badly, either as fans or as players. And I think we've all done a great deal of work at the FA, particularly around our coaches and our coaching workforce, really being very, very clear about what is acceptable and not acceptable behaviour. Because often the coach is the culture leader. And I think it's very important that our coaches are helped and supported to think about use of language, banter, as it's often called, which is often unacceptable banter, unconscious bias. We've done work on all of those things to try to make sure that our coaching workforce, whether they're working with our age group squads or our senior squads, or working in our club structure, really are conscious of setting a culture which is inclusive. What we can't do, and this is something I feel very strongly about, is we don't control society. And unfortunately, there are people who behave badly in society. And whilst football can be an example, both on the field of play and the way we conduct ourselves, in how we should respect each other and how we should be with one another, unfortunately, some people come to our game and behave very badly. And I think we will not countenance that. And we have taken very strong action with the clubs, in partnership with them, to ensure that people who think they can come to football and behave in a way which is totally unacceptable will be punished.
I agree with what Sue just said in terms of what you could control and what you can't control. The fish rottens from the head. And there's a saying, he or she here in the Caribbean, he or she who wears the shoe feels the pinch. What the international bodies who lead and what the big countries and the big leagues need to do is ensure that there are more females and black and colored decision makers at the head table. In terms of sports, the pressure is always on the athletes, but we need more diversity at the management level, at the coaching level, whether it be wherever. We need to see more black and colored managers and coaches and presidents and CEOs. We need to see more female. And until that is done, all it sounds like many times is PR spin, opportunism, bandwagon jumping, and tokenism. There is something fundamental that the international bodies across the sport world and the Olympic world, regardless of sporting disciplines, need to do. And that is why, I really appreciate, and I am part of the SIGA Council, because they are really making significant effort. But for a long while, they are meeting the pushback that comes from the establishment and the status quo that are resistant to change. And, as someone who sits at the head table at a national level and a regional level, and who have gone to many meetings, there is a ceiling, a glass ceiling, even in terms of the conversation. I have experienced racism at international sport meetings where people didn't want to get in an elevator with me or would cross the street. So I'm saying that unless we stop dancing around and putting positive spin on this thing, where it relates to inequalities, we're spinning top in mud. The fish rots from the head.
Brian, I appreciate that you may not want to name names, but you alluded to somebody at a sporting event not wanting to get in an elevator with you, somebody else crossing the street. How, in a bit more detail, do you react to that kind of incident? Is there a need to call them out? Is there a mechanism in your organization to report them? Or ultimately, do you have to just be thick-skinned because there isn't that much more recourse to educate or punish them?
I'm just saying with all respect, even the use of the word thick skin is not, in some cultures, racially neutral. I have chosen to speak out. I'm known to speak out for gender equality. I'm known to speak out for racial equality. I think I have a responsibility to do it. But I think Alex touched on it. When you do meet where situations where the color of your skin, and you see people get offended and defensive about the use of the word white privilege. White privilege really just has to do with the fact that in many situations, white people don't have to deal with the issue of their color of their skin. There may be other factors that would kick in at various points, but it is a reality. It is something you endure because you look at the bigger picture. For me, I have to be very careful, and this is a challenge we face both in terms of gender equality and racial equality, that you don't use the behavior of an individual or two individuals as reflecting the broader organization or broader community. I tend to focus on speaking out. I tend to focus on working with like-minded individuals and groups who want to see gender equality and who want to see racial equality without avoiding the difficult. I think it's important to have the difficult conversation, because at the end of the day, we cannot continue to be academic theoretical. There is a need for practical measures, and this is something that SIGA is leading the way with. So, in answer to your question, maybe I'm ducking. I'm not going to call specifics, but I tend to focus on the solution rather than redefining the problem.
Piara, I want to bring you in here. A question has come in from Densine White from Sporting Equals, and it's relevant to the latter part of this conversation regarding recruitment at highest levels of sport. And Densine asks, is it time for a Rooney-style rule in English football? That, of course, is the NFL policy that requires teams to interview ethnic minority candidates for senior operational or coaching positions. Are you in favour, or are Fair in favour of the Rooney rule?
Well, in short, yes. And we've been advocating for it for quite a long time. Let me take a step back if I can. And I think that Brian actually has made a very compelling case and reminded us that we need to confront structural inequalities that have existed for hundreds of years, whether it's in relation to gender or race. Now, I think also, as he's alluded, you have to acknowledge that, understand it, know how far it goes back, but not be beaten down by that, not see that as a limiter on what you can do. And I think there'll be people tuning into this who are thinking, this is a good discussion, but what can I do within my sports organization? How can I show solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with everyone on this panel? I would say that you look at your own organization, you look at your own domain, and try to identify where you can do better, where your organization can diversify, where the gaps are in terms of representation. Now, in English football, I think in the past, we've all actually had concerns about the FA, its board, the way it makes decisions. But there's been quite a lot of good work being done on that over the last few years. I think we have to say that. You know, the fact that the FA does some pretty interesting things in co-opting people onto the board, the fact that they're independent directors, that they do have some mentoring programs. All of that stuff you have to do. You have to bring all the means that you have, some of it very technical, to the table and try to create change. I'm in favour of the Rooney Rule because it puts people at an interview stage in front of owners, people who are doing the recruiting for head coaches. And the NFL have just changed it as well. They've just beefed it up. It used to be one person of colour who would be interviewed for a head coach job. That's now changed to two. All of the NFL clubs, the franchises now, will be implementing it within each of their administrative areas, looking to interview women and minorities for those jobs. And what that means is that people are being given opportunities, being given space to sell themselves, if you like, where they otherwise wouldn't, where recruiters wouldn't touch them, where they wouldn't know how to get into an organization and an entity. And I think it works. You know, people criticize it because it hasn't had the outcomes that we wanted it to have, but it is a technique that is being used quite widely. It is being shown to work in other areas. I think many tech companies in the US are using it. Many local authorities in the US are using it. It helps you to create some of those changes that you want to see. And of course, yes, Brian also talked about that famous phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You have to have a culture change that goes with that. You need to make sure that your organization knows why you're doing this work, why these people are being given opportunities, equal opportunities. So yes, I'm in favour of it. I think the Premier League really, quite frankly, are the sticking point. But all the data that we've got and all the data that will be coming out in the coming months will show us that there is an underrepresentation of black footballers in leadership positions. And they are a third of the playing staff, but very often 3 or 4% of the coaching teams. That's not good enough. if we're serious about achieving equality.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, just going off of that point, because literally I know the meeting's confidential, so I can't tell you the ins and outs, but I have just been on a meeting with the FA, with some of the key figures that are involved in the game, like when we talk about Chris Hughton, who's obviously a black manager. You've got players on there like Liam Rossini, an ex-player who's now a coach, Rachel Yankee, to me being on there, Gareth Southgate. And the discussion was around that. It's about the action moving forward. And that's when it goes back to my point about getting your own house in order. We want the Premier League to change, but the FA are also taking massive strides in looking at themselves and knowing that they also need to be better. And the Rooney Rule was spoken about. And the thing moving forward as well, it goes back to Sue, maybe you can come in on this, from the last appointment of Phil Neville. We talk about, yes, we want more females involved, and why wasn't there a female coach appointed? We now need to put things in place that when these opportunities, now they're there, that we have this readiness. So I know the next process for Sue, in terms of, we know there's like a Casey Stoney who's now got that experience, women players coming through the game, they know they have a path and those coaching badges, that there's opportunities that one day, yes, they can go on to manage England. And it's the same now within that FA structure when we're talking about getting more coaches involved. We need to make sure that it goes back to mentoring as well, identifying players and younger people that, okay, there's this possibility, here's a mentorship that we can push you. So when those opportunities are there, you are ready. So there's no excuse to say, well, there wasn't anyone to pick, there wasn't anyone going for the interviews. So I'm just alluding back to the conversation with the FA that I've just had, which was really interesting. And it's the actions now moving forward.
But Ben, can I also add to what Alexa said there? And I've heard about the call that she's been on from another source as well. I think one of the problems that we sometimes have is that people hide behind what they call a lack of a pipeline of talent to not make appointments. And that seems to be what the Premier League is doing. They seem to be saying, we do not have enough qualified people who could take up a job as a Premier League manager tomorrow. I think the data that I've seen, I would dispute that. And I think we need to get beyond that point where we say they don't exist and give people chances. Most people will step up into those chances because, quite frankly, when you're looking at recruitment of a Premier League manager, you're not looking at Fred, who plays for the Dog and Duck, are you? You're looking at a player who's played at international level, competed at the highest level, has his or her coaching badges. You're looking at a pool of people who are well qualified. It's the opportunity that's missing, not necessarily the qualified pool of those individuals.
Just to add on that, I think actions speak louder than words, and there is no excuse. And if organisations want to meet the gold standard, which will be the SIGA industry standard, they will have to put in, and we didn't use the word quota, but we put mechanisms and procedures into that standard in order for them to ensure independent directors on the board and diversity. And that's well within the means of an organisation like the Premier League to put in place.
So, Sue, I'd be remiss not to kind of give you a right of response. The Telegraph report into black representation on the governance of sports boards showed a 0 out of 11 on the FA, and that was a pattern across many sports governance boards. But are those numbers a little bit misleading in the sense that the FA has a very complicated structure with lots of different sub-departments, and whoever's on the board is still talking to a number of internal and external sub-departments, such as ones on faith and inclusion with people like Liam Rossini and Paul Elliott on them. There's obviously a women's specific department that you head up, and there's external voices that you'll listen to like Alex. So how important is it that the board at the very top level, those 11 people, does, for example, have at least one black person on them? Is that important for debate? Is that important for leadership? Is that even important for PR? Or is it more important that the overall structure of the FA has those different voices and those different diversities, rather than only focusing on the board at the very, very top?
Well, look, I think the FA's made some progress over the last few years. We published a document called In Pursuit of Progress, which was really our attempt to really put in place some very positive programs. For example, the elite placement coaching program we've done, which is to give black coaches an opportunity to work on England camps alongside players, because I think Alex is right. You've got to help mentor and support, not just simply think people will have that confidence to come through without that support. We do, in fact, have a number of minority ethnic people and a balanced gender board now, which is what we didn't have some years ago on the FA. So great progress has been made in terms of gender balance. And indeed now there's a greater percentage of women on SMT than males, which certainly wasn't the case when I came in 4 years ago. So things are moving, but yes, we still have a lot of work to do, and we know we do. We're not in any way smug. We're on a journey, and I think what's happened over the last few weeks has certainly, picking up Brian's point, made us look not just at initiatives and programs and mentoring and support, but real structural change. And that's going to be a big step for football to take. But we want to play our part. We, the FA, want to play our part in making that happen. We do have an inclusive advisory board headed up by Paul, and that Paul Elliott, and he is black. And that is a very good group that sits and reports directly to the FA board, has brought in a lot of initiatives, is challenging us consistently, as it should. So I think we've got a lot of structures which put together mean that we've made really big progress. But, and it is a but, we know it's not enough. And we are determined to continue, both in terms of gender and race, to drive forward to make sure that football for all is not a slogan, it's a reality. And we know we've still a long way to do to make that happen.
Well said, Sue, and thank you. I'm going to start to wrap things up by giving each of the panelists one more opportunity to conclude, and then we've got a musical surprise for you. Thank you for all of your questions as well via YouTube. I'm sorry if we haven't got to all of them, but we're approaching 4:30, so our 90 minutes are very much up, or almost anyway. So I want to start with Alison, and I think to each of the panelists, it's probably just worthwhile you concluding, along with any general thoughts you may have, by giving us something practical, an action that people can take, point us in the direction of a specific program that someone might be able to sign up for, a specific campaign that they can read about, a specific support group that they can get help with. Anything that somebody listening that thinks, hang on a minute, I don't know where to turn, but I want to get involved. I'm having a problem with a lack of inclusivity, but I'm not sure what to do. Something in your area that somebody watching this can practically do, so we can end this with suggestions to move this debate forwards rather than just words. And Alison, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you.
No, absolutely. And I'll use kind of some examples of what we do at our my own organization. We have open dialogue, and specifically I'll talk about gender equality. We have open dialogue. We listen to our employees. We have regular engagements with the entire organization on the topic. And if you think of sort of the comparison, you know, listen to all your stakeholders, your fans, your own employees. Also, when you think about prioritization, I think I heard it in every which way, but it's about structural change. It's about, you know, seeing kind of representation at the leadership level. It has to be a belief of your organization, and you need to, you know, do something about it, not just say it. So how can you do something about that? There's a lot of resources out there. You know, MasterCard partners with external parties like the 30% Club. We partner and create programming to address confidence in women. It's, you know, Sue, I think you mentioned, you know, often an organization is built around norms, specifically maybe male norms, and people operate differently. They have different things that drive them. So, you know, just looking into how you engage with your own employee base, I think is really a good place to look. And then finding also partners, whether they be to support your efforts in this area, or partners that you do business with. Find ones that align with this vision that you have. I think, Katie, you talked a little bit about that, and even maybe Brian, just ensuring that, who you work with is also aligned on that vision and wants that same change. And, often, two parties are more powerful than one, right? And you'll learn from each other. But I think it's being able to look inside and be open about it, because then I think you can really deliver the experience that you're trying to deliver. We feel that, diversity, inclusion, and all of the efforts that we make as an organization to be better, is better for not only our business, but for society. And I think if you can kind of take that thought into your own organization, it's a place to start.
Alison, thank you. Brian, your closing thoughts and practical suggestions, should you have any?
I'm encouraged. It's always, you feel a little sense of despair and dismay when you have these conversations, because the systemic inequalities, whether it be gender and race, is so entrenched that people become apologists rather than change agents. So, I think that Alex said about accountability. SIGA is doing their part. My ending statement really is that, we all, each of us, have to be the change we want to see. Racism is real. Gender inequality is real. And major organizations such as FIFA, the English FA, the International Olympic Committee, etc., they need to stop paying lip service and tokenism to what needs to be done.
Brian, thank you for joining us and for your candid comments. It's been really fascinating getting your viewpoint. Piara, let's turn to you now for your closing statement.
I think there's a lot of good areas being covered here. Alison's given us a great overview of the way in which we can take action, the way we can look at ourselves. Any corporate entity, whatever the size, can look at itself. I would say listen and watch. Internally, externally, understand what's going on, and then act. It's as simple as that, really. You define what the action is, but make it credible. And as someone said, make sure that you're accountable for it. I don't think we're in the business of telling people exactly what they need to be doing, but they need to bring their intelligence, their processes to bear. And if you're watching what's happening in the US and want to support people there, there's a lot of ways of doing it. In the end, we have our struggles everywhere in the world on these issues. But if you want to go back to the US and look what's happening there, I would say talk to my friends and colleagues at FC Harlem. There you can see the power of sport in Harlem, in operation, the way in which they're bringing on young African-American kids, kids of other impoverished backgrounds, and using football as a means of creating a change in their community and to the lives of those individuals. We need to see more of that.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Katie, let's turn to you and get the closing perspective from SIGA.
My perspective is that racism is not a problem created by sport. Sport is the victim, and I believe that it can be the hero and that it can pave the way. I have three messages. One's for the sports organisations out there. Go through the SIGA independent rating system. We're about to open the pilot phase. Watch this space. And work collaboratively with SIGA and the British Standards Institution, who can offer you practical and in-depth guidance on how you can improve your standards. If you are a young woman, please apply to become one of our mentees for our global mentorship program. And if you are a female leader, I ask you to put your hat up, put your hand up and raise the flag for female leadership in sport. Showcase what you're doing. Join the SIGA Women in Action digital conference that will be publicised and digitalised throughout the next 12 months on this issue.
Katie, thank you. And finally, Alex, let's get your closing thoughts.
Me, when I just look through if there's any parents that are tuning into this, it's like sometimes we raise our young boys to take risks, to be brave, and we raised our daughters to be perfect. I think that needs to change going forward. You know, we need our young females to be confident, to want to take risks, to make those changes happen. And for me, just on a personal note, I always look inwards. What more can I do before I start trying to point fingers at anyone else? And I believe that in telling our own stories first to ourselves and then to one another and then to the world is a revolutionary act. So it is about me, myself, being more educated. What more can I do? And actually, just to leave on a real positive note, the other day, one of my favorite songs came on and it was Sam Cooke. And it's A Change Is Gonna Come. And I honestly believe with everything that's going on in the world at the moment and everything that we've spoken about, a change is definitely gonna come.
Absolutely, Alex. And whilst we've got you here, I think we need to just end by making you turn into pundit mode, specifically on Manchester City against Arsenal. Lots of people that are watching will be very interested to see how you think Arsenal will fare. And even feel free to give us a bit of punditry and prediction on the first game as well, Aston Villa against Sheffield United.
And there was me thinking it was my night off from punditry. No, I think, you know what, I'm just so happy. We know that sport gives everyone so much enjoyment in their life. It's a release, it's a conversation starter. And I'm just so happy that we even get to sit. Yes, we know it's different and it's going to be different for a while, but we have football coming back and we don't know how it's going to be. Obviously, with the no crowds, it's different. But I'm just excited to be able to sit on my sofa tonight and cheer on Arsenal.
Score prediction? I'm going to have to put you on the spot.
Score prediction. Oh no, I don't know. Obviously, Arsenal are playing away from home. We've got Manchester City, so I'll be happy if we come away with 1-0 win. I'll take that.
Great stuff, Alex. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My thanks as well to Dame Sue Campbell, who unfortunately has dropped out and run off to another meeting. She's very busy, of course, and we thank her for giving us 90 minutes of her time. And more generally, thank you to all of the panel for what's been a fascinating discussion on a very broad area. And thank you as well to you for listening on YouTube and all of your questions as well. And do take up the panel's advice on their practical suggestions to learn more and educate yourself about all of these different areas, ranging from gender equality to inclusion and diversity. So thank you to our panel. And we now close with a special surprise. And I said at the very beginning that it was a musical one and it was not me singing karaoke. So you do have to stay on the line for what is going to be a very special and exclusive musical tribute. And then, of course, you can go off and watch Aston Villa Sheffield United, which kicks off in about an hour and a half time. So what we have is not only a surprise, but a musical interlude that has links to both Tom Jones and Michael Jackson. We're delighted to be joined now by the singer Zita Messiah, who has toured with both of those names, and the producer and her husband as well, Paul Kaplan. Both are also SIGA champions, and they're here to give us a sneak preview of a brand new song that is called You Don't Know and is inspired by recent events. Paul and Zita, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about the song that we're going to hear in a moment.
Hi, Ben. It's actually Zitia. That's how you pronounce my name, not Zita.
Always good to know. Thank you.
All right. So I suppose, I tended to ignore racism when I was younger because it was so ugly and painful. And I think I built a wall around myself to protect me from the abuse. But I feel very differently about that now because racism is out in the open and we all need to fight. We all need to help to fight it. And the murder of George Floyd really affected me deeply, as it did people all over the world. The mass demonstrations that are going on at the moment are extraordinary, and they really move me. So Paul and I have been talking recently a lot about race, and I got very emotional when I discussed my experiences as a Black woman in this country growing up. And he wrote the song based on what I told him.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we really don't know how people are going to react to it. It's a very direct statement of how we both feel, I think, but particularly how Zita feels as a Black woman in this country. We're really delighted to have been invited by SIGA to participate in this, the work they're doing on inclusivity and fighting racism in sport. It's fantastic, and thank you to Emmanuel and Katie for asking us to be part of this. The song, when Katie first heard it, it wasn't quite finished.
No, it was not.
Still at the rough mix stage. And she said, "Oh, can we use that? Can we use that?" And so what you're about to hear is a rough mix version. It's not released yet, and the video we made in one day, which I think is a record.
Yeah, it is a record. Yeah,
so we hope you enjoy it.
And Zitia and Paul, just before we hear the song, maybe give us a bit of insight into how you think music can carry a message of inclusion better than perhaps words.
I think it always has, hasn't it? I mean, protest songs are a tradition as old as song, really. And I don't know if you spent much time in, for example, Jamaica, but when there's a problem in Jamaica, the first thing they do is write a song about it.
Yeah, right.
And
Barbados too. Actually.
I think music can be a focal point for people's emotions and feelings. That's kind of what it's for, and songs can help to sum up how they feel. Protest songs have been out of fashion for a while. Maybe they'll come back. Maybe it's time.
Great stuff. Well, Zitia, Paul, looking forward to what's proving to be a SIGA Music exclusive, which I think is a first. So my thanks again to the panel and to all of you for listening as well. And don't forget, Wednesday, the 1st of July is our next discussion, the 5th SIGA Soccerex Forum, and it's entitled Sports Sponsorship, the Comeback. But that is it for now. Thank you for joining us, and we'll play out with the song. And as you know, that is by Zita Messiah.
No, Zitia, get it right.
Zitia, please.
And it has been produced by Paul Kaplan. So here we go with the SIGA exclusive from a brand new song called You Don't Know.
You don't know how it feels. Don't know how it feels. I can't watch those TV shows, all the cell phone videos, too much darkness every night, but you sleep easy, you're white. Understand, you think you get it, you can't, you don't feel it, you can't begin, you're not living in my skin. You don't know how it feels to be black in a white world. without the blues. You don't know how it feels to be black, living in a white world. You don't know how it feels to be black. You don't know how it feels to be black, living in a white world. You don't